The United States entered a completely unique period in its history during the late 19th century and into the 20th century. Since its inception, the United States had always been almost a completely isolationist country that focused primarily on its own borders, new land acquisition, and resolving its internal disputes, particularly over slavery. All that began to change significantly after the Civil War. For the first time, the United States looked beyond its borders in a new way, like it had never before, and even established colonies overseas, which would have been unheard of before to previous generations of Americans. The age of American imperialism coincided with a broader movement of imperialism practiced by European powers during the same time period, and climaxed with American entry into the First World War, sending troops to fight on European lands, again in a manner that would be shocking to previous generations of Americans. In retrospect, the age of American imperialism marked the entry of the United States into the global neighborhood as a world power who demonstrated an interest in what happens overseas, and was the beginning of American influence on world affairs that became almost an expected reality in the 20th and 21st centuries. There were many areas of the world that the United States influenced during its age of imperialism. Lands and islands most Americans had never even heard of before. As a term of the Spanish-American War, the United States made the Philippines a colony. Islands across the Pacific, which would become even more significant in the 20th century, also were acquired by the United States during this time. These islands included Guam, Wake Island, Midway Island, Johnston Island, and American Samoa. The formerly known Sandwich Islands became the Hawaiian Islands, and an American possession during this time. The United States purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire in 1867. The American military, usually the Marines, conducted operations or influenced events in a multitude of South American nations, including Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Chile, Venezuela, and Santo Domingo. Also, as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and made Cuba a protectorate under its watchful influence for the next several decades. The Danish West Indies also became the U.S. Virgin Islands during this period. The age of imperialism marked the entry of the United States onto the world stage on a large scale and broadened the concern of the Americans into lands far and near in an unprecedented manner. It is important to distinguish this new internationalism at the turn of the century from previous similar ventures by Americans onto the international stage, such as the Barbary War and the Mexican-American War. This time period at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century is sometimes labeled the New Manifest Destiny. By a new manifest destiny, an unprecedented and wider involvement in world affairs was meant. Before this time period, the United States had never endeavored to create colonies overseas. They had never sent troops to so many locations at the same time overseas. So many Americans had never had such large interests overseas before. Such a robust debate over America's role in the world had never occurred before. There were many causes or motivations for this new manifest destiny. Whereas the old manifest destiny was the belief that it was America's divine mission to spread from coast to coast and bring constitutionalism, capitalism, and Christianity, the new manifest destiny held to many of the former goals, but directed them overseas now that the American continent had been conquered and settled after the last of the Indian Wars. Many saw the end of the frontier as a sign that it was time to spread Americanism around the world and bring its values and prosperity to other less fortunate lands. In this sense, overseas ventures would serve as the safety valve to release the internal tensions that the Old West used to provide. Many Americans saw imperialism as a convenient cover for the expansion of Christian missions, an opportunity to bring the gospel and translate the Bible to those who had never been exposed to Christianity before. The age of imperialism certainly coincides with the great age of missions in the 19th century, during which more Western missionaries and Bible translators ventured into foreign lands than ever before. Americans were also interested in finding new markets for their Gilded Age industrial goods and saw imperialism as an effective means to acquire colonies and penetrate foreign lands to find new buyers for their goods. The quest for natural resources was also a central motivator for the United States to get involved overseas, looking for new materials for its industrial production, including oil, rubber, diamonds, sugar, fruit, or lacquerware. As the United States constructed a larger and more modern navy, they also needed foreign ports at which to refuel and patrol foreign waters. Moreover, so many European powers were engaged in colonization and imperialism across Africa and Asia that there was a feeling that the United States would be left behind if it also did not participate. There existed almost an international peer pressure to get there before someone else did. The popular newspapers and publications nicknamed the Yellow Press in the United States also motivated Americans to engage in challenges overseas, often to liberate oppressed peoples or to strike down an oppressive occupying power. Social Darwinism also carried popular appeal during the era, as not a few saw the civilized Anglo-Saxons carrying a moral imperative to bring improvement to lesser peoples around the globe. These are some of the many motivations that led the United States to become an imperial power during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This political cartoon from the time humorously captures the changing United States as a quite enlarged Uncle Sam gets fitted for new and larger clothes by his tailor, the President of the United States, William McKinley. Indeed, at the end of the age of imperialism, the United States was far larger than the Founding Fathers had ever imagined. Even as the United States was embarking on a new era of internationalism, it was ending another. The historic enemy of the United States, ever since the Revolutionary War, had been Great Britain. The United States had already fought 2 wars against Britain, and often tensely moved towards more conflict with Great Britain, such as during the Oregon debate or the Trent affair. But by the late 19th century, the interests of the United States and Great Britain became alike, and they, at long last, were able to put their differences aside. The reconciliation between these 2 great industrial and military powers became known as the Great Rapprochement. Later, the close economic and military alliance between the United States and Great Britain would impel them to become allies during the 2 world wars, the Cold War and the War on Terror. Later, the closeness between the 2 powers would become known as the special relationship, the notion that the US and UK always stand shoulder to shoulder on world issues, sharing a close bond and common interests. The Great Rapprochement was formed during the Age of Imperialism. A final pivotal motivator for U.S. involvement overseas was a series of lectures delivered at the Naval War College and then published for the public to appreciate and adopt. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan had served an extensive career in the U.S. Navy and accepted an invitation to deliver a series of talks on the historic role of sea power. His series, which when published together in 1890 was titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, examined the critical role control of the seas played from the classical period to the present. Mahan's not-so-subtle thesis was that all major world powers relied on a strong navy to rise to the top, and if the United States was to take its place on the world stage, it too would need to expand and modernize its navy to match those of the great European powers. Mahan also argued for the expansion of foreign markets, expanding the merchant marine fleet, planting colonies in strategic locations, and providing better protection of the free commerce of the world. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt took great interest in Mahan's lectures, and the 2 shared a strong affinity for the future use of naval power. The pivotal role the U.S. Navy played in 20th century world affairs may have seen its summons to prominence in the original lectures of Alfred Thayer Mahan. Construction of a large and modern navy, made previously inaccessible, now suddenly reachable. To the north, American interests were directed towards the vast lands of the Russian territory of Alaska. The Russian possession was located in a precarious spot, as it was too far for the Tsar to effectively manage, but too close to the British possession of Canada, and therefore the Russians wanted to keep the territory out of British hands. The Alaskan mainland, as well as the Aleutian Islands, reached far out into the Pacific, but that did not make them much more accessible or easy for settlement for the Russians. By the mid-19th century, the Russian imperial government knew that they wanted to keep their far-off territory out of British hands, but they also did not know exactly what they wanted to do with it. Alaska's breathtaking wilderness filled with grizzly bears, king salmon, and king crabs may have seemed appealing, but its wild landscape and harsh weather also made the territory very difficult to reach and even more difficult to settle. During the reign of Catherine the Great, 100 years earlier, the Russians had established some settlements in the territory. They had hoped to discover gold, or at least establish a strategic port in the territory. But the sheer cost and difficulty of maintaining the territory always made Alaska an afterthought to the Russians, and the territory never received the attention or investment it needed to prove profitable. Harvesting the pelts from the local sea otter population was valuable, but the Russians worried mostly, again, about the British seizing the territory and its tiny capital of Kodiak. If the British took Alaska, they would have a strategic base against which they could threaten Russian interests in the far northern Pacific. If the Russians sold the territory to a different power, however, then that power would be able to protect the sovereignty of Alaska and maintain more of a balance of power in the region. It was for these reasons that negotiations were opened up between the Russians and the Americans after the American Civil War was over to discuss the purchase of Alaska by the United States government from the Imperial Russian government. Controversially, and to the shock of many, the Alaska Treaty of Cessation was signed between the two governments on March 30th, 1867. The treaty had been negotiated by Russian Minister Edward de Stokel and the American Secretary of State, appointed by Abraham Lincoln, William H. Seward. The Russian motivations for signing the treaty included recovering some of their losses from the defeat in the Crimean War, checking the aggressive imperialism of the British, and stopping the losses they were experiencing from the low profits generated by the Alaskan settlements. The Americans, particularly William H. Seward, had their own motivations for purchasing the Alaskan territory. The purchase coincided with the territorial expansion the U.S. had conducted throughout the 19th century. American speculators believed there was an abundance of gold in Alaska waiting to be discovered and unearthed. Moreover, possession of Alaska would provide a spot for American naval and marine ports in the North Pacific. The price paid for U.S. acquisition of Alaska was $7.2 million, which would surpass $125 million in modern value. The purchase price was equivalent to less than 2 cents per acre. Alaska would become the 49th state admitted to the Union in January of 1959. William Seward was pleased with the price and purchase he had negotiated, but many Americans were not. Many Americans questioned what was the value of spending so much money on a vast parcel of land hundreds of miles away from the continental United States that nobody seemed to want, and in which there seemed to be nothing of value. Critics called the purchase Seward's icebox and Seward's folly, as if the Secretary of State had purchased nothing more than ice, polar bears, and otters. But in time, the wisdom of Seward's purchase would be proven many times over. Indeed, at the turn of the century, gold was discovered in Alaska, leading to another of the gold rushes that defined the century. When gold was first discovered in the neighboring Canadian province of the Yukon Territory, over 100,000 eager prospectors traversed Alaska to reach the gold fields. When gold was later discovered near Nome, Alaska, another large group braved Alaska's wilderness to look again for gold. Some became rich, but most traveled in vain. The gold rushes in Alaska did lead to the construction of multiple boom towns that brought settlers to the interior of Alaska and encouraged further development. Over time, the wisdom of Seward's Alaska purchase would be validated not with gold, but rather oil. Prudhoe Bay oil field is the largest oil field in North America and originally contained 25 billion barrels of oil. Large deposits of natural gas are also located in Alaska. The difficulty in accessing the oil at Prudhoe Bay has always been the cold temperatures and the great distances between the bay and larger settlements. To meet the challenge and reach this isolated area, the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline was constructed in the 1970s and carried its first barrel of oil in 1977. Since the opening of the 800-mile-long pipeline, the Alaskan Pipeline has transported almost 20 billion gallons of oil across the state. The construction of the pipeline was particularly challenging, maneuvering over the rural and rough terrain of Alaska and reaching isolated areas. An additional challenge was navigating the permafrost of Upper Alaska and protecting the pipeline from cold temperatures while also minimizing its environmental impact. Special heat pipes carry the pipeline through some particularly cold areas and effectively diffuse the heat without thawing the nearby permafrost. The Alaskan Pipeline remains in operation today, but its production peaked in 1988, and since that year, it has declined by more than 65%. As Americans began to look beyond the confines of North America, they looked to areas that could provide profitable and strategic areas for their interests. One of those locations were the Hawaiian Islands. Originally known as the Sandwich Islands, the archipelago, or island chain, was a set of volcanic islands located almost 2,500 miles from the coast of the United States. Although settled for hundreds of years earlier, the Sandwich Islands were first explored by a European in 1778 when Captain James Cook and his crew visited them. Americans arrived in growing numbers in the early 19th century as part of whaling expeditions, where they recruited native Hawaiians as sailors. Americans who stayed in the islands established sugar plantations. Multitudes of Chinese, Filipinos, and Japanese also arrived to work on the sugar plantations. An original constitution which granted broad voting rights, regardless of gender or nationality, was suddenly rewritten by American plantation owners near the end of the 19th century. Only those meeting higher income or land ownership requirements were subsequently allowed to vote. This new constitution became known as the Bayonet Constitution, as if it was at the threatened tip of a bayonet that signatories were forced to accept the new instrument of government. The Constitution was particularly crafted to rein in the excesses of the Hawaiian king. Known as the Merry Monarch, the Hawaiian king Kalakaua loved to entertain and spend lavishly on large meals for his guests and publicly played his ukulele, which had previously been banned. The American businessmen who operated the plantation saw Kalakaua as an obstacle to stable government and business in the islands, and used the Bayonet Constitution to reel him in and endeavor to reduce corruption in the island's government. King Kalakaua signed the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875 with the United States, granting Americans a free trade agreement that allowed Hawaiian sugar to be exported to the United States duty-free. The treaty also gave the United States sole use of Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. King Kalakaua became the first reigning monarch to visit America and the first honored guest at the first state dinner ever held at the White House, hosted by President Ulysses Grant. Not having a child or heir of his own, King Kalakaua named his sister as his heir to the Hawaiian throne. Queen Liliuokalani, better known as Queen Lil, would prove to be the last reigning monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Queen Liliuokalani was baptized as a Christian, well-educated, and married to an American with whom she had no children. Liliuokalani ascended to the throne of Hawaii 9 days after her brother's death. She immediately set out to amend the Bayonet Constitution, restore the power of her monarchy, and restore voting rights to natives excluded in the kingdom. The American ministers opposed the Queen's efforts to reduce their influence and were determined to remove her from power and enable the United States to annex the islands. American Minister John L. Stevens was under instructions to protect American citizens, commerce, and interests in the event of instability in the islands. He now took his orders even further and asked for a company of uniformed U.S. Marines to land from the USS Boston, anchored offshore, as well as 2 companies of U.S. sailors to land and surround the U.S. diplomatic buildings. A provisional government was established by the Honolulu Rifles, which was a militia group that forced the Queen to surrender her throne. Queen Liliuokalani continued to protest to President Grover Cleveland's government that she had been unlawfully removed from her throne because of the coup, but her protests were eventually dismissed. On July 4th, 1894, the Republic of Hawaii was established. The following year, in 1895, there was an attempted counter-revolution to restore the monarchy, but it failed. Queen Liliuokalani was convicted and imprisoned for supporting the rebellion. She was imprisoned for several days in the upstairs bedroom of the Iolani Palace in Honolulu, the former residency of the Hawaiian monarch. The Queen was subsequently released and then granted a full pardon in 1896. The Hawaiian Islands were annexed by a joint resolution of Congress in July 1898. The Hawaiian flag was lowered over the Iolani Palace, and the American flag was raised in its place. Hawaii was a U.S. territory between 1898 and 1959. It would not be until 1959 that Hawaii would become the 50th state admitted to the Union. The economy of Hawaii today provides a multitude of U.S. staples, including fish, sugar, pineapples, and rare woods. Since statehood in 1959, tourism has become the dominant portion of the Hawaiian economy. The natural port of Pearl Harbor was one of the prime reasons for the U.S. interest in the Hawaiian Islands from the very beginning. The naval station would garner particular attention during the 20th century and remains a pivotal base for U.S. naval operations in the Pacific Ocean. If the United States intended to play a broader role in world affairs, they did not need to look very far. 90 miles off the tip of Florida, the island of Cuba was locked in an extended struggle between the native Cuban population and the Spanish who had colonized the island during the 16th century Age of Discovery. Spain's empire had been in decline for 3 centuries, but they were determined to hold on to what remained of their empire as an expression of Spanish nationalism. The island's Cuban population, of course, saw their colonization differently. The Cubans frequently resisted the Spanish occupation, sometimes randomly and sometimes with more organization. The Cuban freedom fighters were known as Mambises, and particularly they attacked larger Spanish settlements during their insurrection known as Cuba's 10 Years' War. The Mambises received weapons and support from some supporters in the United States, but they were never strong enough to rout the Spanish and drive them from the island. The native Cubans, however, continued to maintain a close relationship with the United States. American businessmen owned a controlling interest in the sugar fields of Cuba, and far greater amount of the island's sugar was exported to the United States than to Spain itself. Many recognized that Spain controlled the island politically, but the United States controlled the island economically. The Spanish government doubled its efforts to suppress further rebellions by the Cubans by assigning an experienced general in quelling colonial revolts. General Valeriano Weyler was appointed Governor General of the Philippines and Cuba, and later became a minister for war. Weyler decided to get tough with the Mambisi guerrilla fighters living in rural areas. He forced the non-guerrilla population off of their lands in the countryside and forced them into larger villages and cities. Crops were burned and farms destroyed to prevent the civilians from returning. The reconcentrating of Cuban civilians into more densely populated areas led to overcrowding, high unemployment, food shortages, starvation, and rampant disease. General Valeriano was nicknamed Butcher Weyler in the American press for his oppressive policies leading to catastrophic loss of life. Moving such a large portion of the population to overcrowded areas without a plan to sustain them provoked worldwide outrage. These reconcentrations of population, or reconcentrados, are often considered the world's first concentration camps, the first use of a system that would produce appalling results in the 20th century. Despite the high death toll, Weyler persisted with his policy, and much of the back of the resistance was broken in the countryside. Yet the savage results for their fellow Cubans only provoked a simmering anger against the Spanish authorities that threatened to explode once again in a matter of time. It is estimated that 200,000 Cubans died of starvation and disease during the Cuban War for Independence. Americans were made aware of the atrocities occurring in Cuba through the aggressive and sensational journalism produced by two of America's greatest newspaper magnates, Joseph J. Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Joseph J. Pulitzer was a Hungarian immigrant who gained free passage to the United States by his willingness to fight for the Union during the American Civil War. After the war, he moved into newspaper publishing and acquired the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The newspaper was rebranded as the paper for the common man and featured hard-hitting editorials and sensational journalism that attracted a broad readership. Pulitzer, after acquiring the failing New York World newspaper from Jay Gould, used the same approach that gave him success in St. Louis and turned the New York World into a national newspaper with a broad populist readership. William Randolph Hearst was the son of a millionaire mine owner in San Francisco and took over management of his father's newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, in 1887. The newspaper also advertised itself as a defender of the common man and often exposed corruption and greed within large corporations. Looking to make a bigger name for himself, Hearst acquired a New York newspaper and rebranded it the New York Journal, once again appealing to a popular audience and selling copies for only a penny, which the working man could afford. The late 19th and early 20th centuries became the great age of newspaper consumption and competition, in large part because of the rivalry between Pulitzer's New York World and Hearst's New York Journal. Both men were determined to outsell the other, and both practiced a form of journalism growing in popularity at the time known as the Yellow Press. Yellow Press journalism refers to sensationalized journalism, exaggerated, vivid, and overtly violent or sexual accounts to tantalize readers and boost newspaper sales. This form of journalism earned its nickname from the yellowish paper upon which such newspapers were originally published. The deteriorating humanitarian situation in Cuba provided the perfect topic for Pulitzer and Hearst, and the American public could not wait to read the next issue of the Yellow Press with additional shocking stories regarding what Spain, and particularly Butcher Weiler, was doing to the freedom-loving Cubans. Detailed drawings reported on the starvation of the Cubans, particularly children. Spanish authorities were accused of strip-searching women even on American ships looking for evidence of their support for the Cuban rebellion. The Spanish in these Yellow Press cartoons were often depicted as animals, beasts, savages who were bloodthirsty and indifferent to the plight of their colonial subjects. The black legend the English exaggerated regarding Spanish atrocities in the New World during the Age of Discovery was updated, and now Weiler was viewed as yet another brutal conquistador bent on occupation and savagery. Meanwhile, the helpless Cuban mothers lamented the loss of their fathers, husbands, and sons. The Yellow Press effectively built a growing indignation against Spain and their treatment of the Cubans among the American people. The crisis heightened and events accelerated in early 1898 when the United States decided to post ships offshore of Cuba to be nearby in the event that American citizens needed to be protected or evacuated from Cuba. The USS Maine was a second-class battleship or armored cruiser that was constructed in the Brooklyn Naval Yard in 1897. The Maine was the largest ship in the U.S. Navy at the time. The Maine measured 324 feet long and displaced almost 7,000 tons and carried 12-inch steel plating. 8 boilers powered Maine's 2 steam engines, and her main armament was 4 10-inch guns. The Maine journeyed from Key West, Florida, to the harbor of Havana, Cuba, and arrived January 25, 1898. The Maine was to remain in the harbor off the coast and be prepared to be summoned into action. 290 sailors, 26 officers, and 39 Marines were on board. On February 15, 1898, at 9:40 p.m., a massive explosion ripped through the front of the ship. Approximately 5 tons of gun shells all exploded at once, obliterating the front of the ship. The ship was lifted into the air, and then settled to the bottom of the harbor in pieces. Most of the ship's enlisted crew was resting or sleeping in the front quarters of the ship when the explosion occurred. 266 sailors died from the explosion. 89 survived, including 18 officers and the captain of the Maine. An immediate debate commenced in the American government regarding the reason for the explosion. All subsequent investigations agreed that the detonation of the forward armament caused the explosion, but it was unclear why the magazine of shells exploded. The Spanish government quickly concluded that the Maine exploded because of a boiler explosion that detonated the gun shells, and that no Spanish mine in the harbor of Havana could cause such an explosion. An initial inquiry led by the United States Navy concluded that it was a Spanish mine that detonated against the Maine in the harbor, leading to the shell magazine's explosion. Further investigations in the decades to come would seem to validate the original Spanish conclusion that a boiler explosion ignited the ship's ammunition locker, and that the explosion came from the inside of the ship rather than the outside. A final conclusive cause for the armament's explosion has never really been determined. The American public, however, saw little need for naval inquiries and investigations with ambiguous conclusions. Outrage immediately spread across the country, and by large numbers the Spanish authorities were blamed for the Maine's explosion. The American public fully believed that the Spanish government had planted mines in the harbor and it had led to the destruction of the Maine. The Spanish had no doubt planted mines in the harbor. One of them had exploded in the Maine, according to the U.S. argument. U.S. sailors were dead. This was an act of war by the government of Spain against the United States. Shouts of "Remember the Maine" and "To hell with Spain" reverberated across the country, with many Americans eager to avenge the insult. Popular agitation was only heightened by the yellow press and the publications of Pulitzer and Hearst. The papers were careful to avoid exonerating the Spanish, even though few verifiable details were known. The yellow press not so casually implied the explosion of the Maine was the fault of the Spanish and intentional. American readership only increased, and calls for war against Spain also increased. In the same month as the explosion of the Maine, Cuban revolutionaries intercepted a letter from the Spanish ambassador to the United States to the foreign minister of Spain. Señor Don Enrique Dempuy de Lome had hoped to secretly correspond with his supervisor back in Spain regarding the revolt of the Cubans, President McKinley's diplomacy, and the growing threat of war between the United States and Spain. But his telegram was intercepted by the Mambises and passed along to the Hearst newspaper, New York Journal. The de Lome letter, as it came to be known, insulted the American president by remarking, quote, "Besides the natural and inevitable coarseness with which he repeats all that the press and public opinion of Spain has said of Weyler, it shows once more what McKinley is, weak and catering to the rabble, and besides, a low politician who desires to leave a door open to me and to stand well with the jingoes of his party." Unquote. Here was a foreign official insulting the American president. Even though many Americans might have agreed with the remark, the letter seemed to be yet another insult against the sovereignty of the United States by Spain in the month of February 1898. There were therefore a multitude of reasons why the United States went to war against Spain in 1898 in what would become known as the Spanish-American War. The United States held economic interests in Cuba, seeking to maintain the robust sugar trade with the island. The American public was horrified by Spanish abuses against the Cuban people so close to their shores. The explosion of the Maine was pinned on the Spanish and was recast as an unprovoked attack by Spain against the United States. The de Lome letter further insulted the United States when tensions were already high between the two countries. The Spanish-American War also conformed to the interests of the United States during its broader age of imperialism and made foreign involvements in dispatching troops overseas more likely. The Spanish-American War also had perhaps the unintended effect of uniting the nation, which had of course been driven apart during the American Civil War. Now, both North and South Americans would be fighting together on the same side against a common enemy. On April 25th, 1898, the United States declared war against Spain. The Spanish-American War was fought on a multitude of fronts beyond Cuba. The Americans approached the war from a broad perspective and saw an opportunity to wage war against Spain on multiple fronts and to seize overseas territories from the government of Spain. Acting on orders from the Naval Department, American Commodore George Dewey, upon the American declaration of war, immediately sailed his fleet into the harbor of Manila, the capital city of the Spanish colony of the Philippines. Dewey wanted to prevent the Spanish fleet at Manila from moving from one colony to another in order to defend Cuba. A quick strike against the Spanish fleet, therefore, would eliminate the enemy fleet and even secure the Philippines for the Americans before they concentrated on Cuba. It was not much of a contest in Manila Bay, as the American fleet, with its superior ships, crews, and gunnery, made easy work of the Spanish fleet. The American fleet raked the Spanish with their portside guns and then passed by again using their starboard guns. The Americans made 5 passes against the Spanish in total. The Spanish returned fire, but many of their ships' guns and also their land batteries were out of range and could not reach the American ships. On the evening of May 1st, the Spanish surrendered to the American fleet. The Americans under Dewey barely experienced any casualties. Spanish losses were far greater. In a quick stroke, the Americans had knocked out Spain's Pacific Fleet, and the door was open to the Americans moving on land in the Philippines. American troops were subsequently landed in the Philippines to eliminate additional pockets of Spanish resistance. They found willing and eager allies in the native Filipino population, who had also suffered significant deprivations and oppression under Spanish rule. The combined American and Filipino troops quickly overwhelmed Spanish positions and toppled the Spanish government. The Philippines were now firmly under American control. The war had barely begun, and Spain had already lost one of its fleets and one of its largest remaining colonies from the Age of Discovery. While in the region of the Pacific, American forces also moved against the large Spanish island of Guam. Ferdinand Magellan had been the first European to visit Guam during his circumnavigation of the world, and ever since the Age of Discovery, the island had been a valuable resupply base for the Spanish galleons sailing between South America and the Philippines. But as Spain had declined in recent years, so too had Spanish interest in the island. By the time of the Spanish-American War, it had been a full year and a half since a Spanish warship had even visited Guam. Thus, the local Spanish occupants were taken completely by surprise when the USS Charleston arrived in Agana Harbor and started firing at Spanish shore batteries. The Spanish defenders were not even aware that Spain was at war with the United States and believed the rounds fired at them from the Charleston were a salute. The harbor's defenders left their positions and approached the Charleston in the harbor, apologizing, for they had no gunpowder to return the salute. The Americans informed the Spanish that the United States and Spain were at war, and the Americans demanded the surrender of the island. In their confusion, the Spanish were willing to give up Guam, and now Guam had been acquired by America in the early part of the war. While the United States Navy was well prepared for the outbreak of war against Spain in 1898, the American Army definitely was not. The Army had shrunk significantly since the end of the American Civil War and the conclusion of the West Indian Wars. Only 25,000 soldiers comprised the regular Army, and many of them were poorly trained or conducted training exercises with Civil War-era rifles and tactics. As war approached, however, many Americans volunteered for service, seeking to be part of the action. 100,000 Americans had actually volunteered for service the very first night after the explosion of the Maine. President McKinley asked for 100,000 volunteers, but actually 200,000 ended up volunteering in the end. Many National Guard units were activated for deployment as well. The most notable of all volunteers for the war was Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt came from a wealthy Manhattan family and had embarked on a career in politics, had served as New York City Police Commissioner, and was delighted to be named Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Although only the Assistant Secretary, Roosevelt was not averse to going over his boss's head, the Secretary of the Navy, John Long. When Long went on vacation shortly before the outbreak of war, Roosevelt ordered Commodore Dewey to be prepared for war in an aggressive move that was not authorized by Long and horrified the secretary. When war was declared, Roosevelt was determined to be part of the fight on the ground, however. Always longing to serve in combat, Roosevelt begged for a commission and received one. He formed the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment with Colonel Leonard Wood. His notoriety led to a flood of volunteers begging to be part of the temporary unit that would soon be nicknamed the Rough Riders. The 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry was intended to be composed of frontiersmen from the Indian, New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma territories. But in the end, it was composed of a motley collection of Ivy League athletes, Glee Club singers, Texas Rangers, and Native Americans. Other members were cowboys, mining prospectors, hunters, and gamblers. Skill in horsemanship was required to be part of the unit, but ironically, the regiment would fight on foot as infantry in Cuba when their horses failed to arrive. The regiment received the most publicity of any unit during the Spanish-American War and made Roosevelt a household name and a rising national figure. 1/4 of the Rough Riders, however, perished during training in the southeastern United States due to malaria, yellow fever, and typhoid fever before they had even departed for Cuba. Despite the protestations of his wife and family, Roosevelt was ecstatic to be going off to war. He outfitted himself with a new uniform from Brooks Brothers and packed 2 pairs of spectacles for his journey to Cuba. The Rough Riders finally got going, leaving from the port of Tampa and then sailing for over a day before arriving on the island of Cuba. On June 22, 1898, as they departed the port of Tampa, they were seen off by bands and large crowds cheering for them and playing popular tunes. The men arrived on June 23rd on the eastern end of the island and quickly set up camp. The next day, scout teams were dispatched inland and quickly encountered Spanish resistance. The Rough Riders first engaged scattered Spanish forces at Las Guasimas, but despite the concealed positions of the Spanish, the Rough Riders were able to move further inland. The cavalry unit moved inland as their orders were to preoccupy, but not endeavor to take, the San Juan Heights that were hills to the east of the Spanish citadel of Santiago. A larger American force was to bombard the Spanish at Santiago, and then the 2 groups would meet up with the Spanish between them. The San Juan Heights to the east of Santiago were composed of 2 prominent hills and a valley or pond between them. A river ran in front of both summits. The hill to the right was known as Kettle Hill, and the hill to the left was San Juan Hill, both part of the larger San Juan Heights. Roosevelt grew dissatisfied leaving his men at the base of the hill while alternate units fired at the heights. He felt that his men were dangerously exposed to Spanish sniper fire and barely concealed. Roosevelt sought and received permission to engage the Spanish on the heights and ordered his men up the hill, to follow him as he charged forward on his horse, and not to turn back, or he himself would shoot them with his sidearm. Ordering his men forward to move quickly up the hill, Roosevelt yelled "Charge!" and took off on his horse up Kettle Hill. Roosevelt rode off, galloping up the hill. He waved his hat and cheered, letting his men see him on horseback, unafraid, trying to inspire others to follow him. The Rough Riders raced up Kettle Hill behind Roosevelt, cheering and yelling as they returned fire against the Spanish blockhouses on the summit. Roosevelt's charge with the Rough Riders up Kettle Hill was aided by strong covering fire provided by 3 Gatling guns, which directed 18,000 rounds towards the pillboxes at the summit of the hill. Within 20 minutes of fighting, the pillboxes on top of the San Juan Heights were silenced, and the Americans took the summit of the hills. A Spanish counterattack later was turned back, once again by those American Gatling guns. American losses were high at the assault of the hills, with over 1,000 casualties, including 144 deaths. The Spanish suffered less than 500 casualties. Roosevelt called his assault up the heights his crowded hour, and his brief charge up Kettle Hill would propel him after the war into the New York governor's mansion, the vice presidency of the United States, and eventually the presidency of the United States. A park memorializing all those who fought for Cuba's freedom and independence is located at the summit of Kettle Hill today. Even though Roosevelt's assault occurred going up Kettle Hill, because he was part of the San Juan Heights and the adjacent hill was called San Juan Hill, the victory was recorded as occurring on San Juan Hill rather than Kettle Hill, where it actually occurred. The Rough Riders' victory at Kettle Hill is one of the two misnamed battles in American history, the other being the Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually occurred on the adjacent Breed's Hill. The Rough Riders' victory at the San Juan Heights enabled them to secure the high ground above the city of Santiago. A U.S. naval squadron, meanwhile, destroyed the Spanish ships in Santiago's harbor, rendering the Spanish Navy a devastating blow. Finding themselves completely surrounded at their harbor and the surrounding hills, the Spanish garrison surrendered to the Americans on July 17, 1898. Spanish forces at Guantanamo Bay also surrendered. Remaining pockets of resistance collapsed, and the war was effectively over during the summer of 1898. While the Americans were on campaign in Cuba, they also decided to move against the Spanish island of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. The American offensive commenced on May 12, 1898, when 12 U.S. ships attacked Puerto Rico's capital of San Juan. The city's harbor was blockaded, and General Nelson Miles commenced his land offensive with 1,300 troops on July 25, 1898. Significant pockets of Spanish troops resisted the American advance, but were poorly supplied and trained and were soon overwhelmed by American forces. Puerto Rico was now in American hands and would be included as a significant concession by the Spanish to the Americans in the final peace treaty. Puerto Rico remains an important U.S. territory still today. Hostilities ended between the United States and Spain on August 12, 1898. The final peace treaty was signed by the United States and Spain in Paris on December 10, 1898, and ratified easily by the United States Senate in February of the following year. The spoils of victory for the United States were great. The United States gained new colonies in the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Cuba was not made an American colony, but it did become an American protectorate in which its foreign affairs were largely controlled by the United States. Secretary of State John Hay would notably call the Spanish-American War a splendid little war for its brevity, quick victory, minimal losses, and significant gains. Indeed, the majority of U.S. troop deaths during the war, which approximated 2,400 dead, was a small number compared to the greater losses about to occur during the world wars, and the majority of these deaths were due to tropical sicknesses rather than Spanish bullets. The Spanish-American War unquestionably signaled U.S. entry and intervention onto the world stage that stood in marked contrast to its previous foreign policy and previous wars. Cuba gained its independence in 1902, but not before Cubans agreed to a treaty that still granted the United States broad influence in the island nation. The Platt Amendment was attached to an Army appropriations bill and stipulated that Cuba would not make any treaty that weakened its independence. Cuba had to promise to allow the United States to buy or lease naval stations on its territory. The nation's public debt must not exceed its ability to pay, and the United States was assured the right to intervene in Cuba as it found necessary. Cuban independence was contingent on its acquiescence to the treaty. The U.S. naval and marine base at Guantanamo Bay on the extreme southeastern portion of the island would prove to be the most valuable during the crises of the 20th century and beyond. It remained a strategic naval port for the United States during two world wars, the Cold War, and then during the War on Terror in the 2000s. During the War on Terror, many Islamic terrorists captured on the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq would be interned at the base, provoking a national debate over the U.S. government's treatment of its POWs. Although Cuba was independent after the Spanish-American War, American economic domination of the island would continue for decades to come, and several corrupt dictators would govern the island, supported by American economic interests. The seizure of power by Fidel Castro and his communist supporters in 1959 would inaugurate a new period of strain in U.S.-Cuban relations for many decades to come. Not all native populations were particularly excited about exchanging one colonial master for another. While the transition to American possession was more or less peaceful in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam, in the Philippines, a protracted war of insurrection was fought by the U.S. Army to subdue the Philippines and secure control of the island chain. Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been instrumental in leading Filipino resistance against the Spanish colonizers, now turned against the United States once he learned the Americans did not plan to give the Philippines their immediate independence and then depart. Aguinaldo renewed the guerrilla campaign that he had first led against the Spanish and now directed his forces to resist the Americans. His resistance as president did not last long, however, and he was swiftly captured in 1901, ending his tenure of leadership. The Philippine-American War was declared concluded in 1902, but pockets of guerrillas continued their resistance to American rule for years to come. Some of the last rebel groups were not even subdued until 1913. Approximately 200,000 Filipino civilian deaths occurred during the war, mostly due to famine and cholera. Atrocities were committed by both sides, and the savagery of the war raised protests in the United States that American imperialism was proving to be a betrayal of American values, as delineated in the Declaration of Independence. The United States moved the Philippines towards independence and self-government, and independence was granted to the Philippines in 1946 after the Japanese occupied the island chain during the Second World War, and heavy fighting by the Americans and Filipinos led to its liberation. The Philippines remains an important U.S. ally today, right off the coast of mainland Asia. American imperialists set their sights on the South Pacific as well during the 19th century. The Samoan Islands were originally known as the Navigator Islands, as the archipelago developed a reputation because of its skilled boatmen. The Samoans were also known as headhunters, as a means to prove one's strength and manliness was not only to defeat one's enemy, but also to cut off their head and bring it to show the tribe's chief. The British, Germans, and Americans all showed interest in gaining control of the Samoan Islands and even fought each other through proxy wars among the Samoan tribes. Eventually, the British turned their attention elsewhere, and in 1899, the Western Islands became German colonies, and the Eastern Islands became American possessions. New Zealanders seized the Western Islands from Germany during World War I and ruled them until 1961. In 1962, Western Samoa became a sovereign state, now simply known as Samoa. American Samoa, however, remained a territory of the United States, and in 1967 adopted a constitution and became self-governing. American Samoa became a strategic island base during the Second World War, and many Samoan young men trained for combat service. Tuna canneries provide the primary industry today in American Samoa. American Samoa is sometimes nicknamed also the Football Islands for the high proportionate number of college and professional football players that originate from this important American territory. Two other islands were acquired by the United States during the Age of Imperialism that would prove very significant during the 20th century. Wake Island had been discovered by the Spanish in the 16th century and had been observed by other nations, but it was the Americans who claimed Wake Island as a U.S. territory in 1899. The most significant feature constructed on Wake Island eventually would be its airfield. Wake would be occupied by the Japanese at the beginning of World War II and remain under Japanese occupation throughout the war. Although there are no permanent residents on Wake Island, several dozen people occupy the island at any given time and still service the landing strip that is there as a refueling stop or strip for emergency landings. Midway Atoll is also a remote island group, which is roughly equidistant between North America and Asia, and therefore appropriately named Midway. Consisting of two larger islands and almost a circular reef creating a large lagoon, Midway's most important feature is the airfield that the Americans would construct there before World War II. Midway, previously unknown to most Americans, would become the scene of the turning point of America's Pacific War during World War II. Midway remains largely uninhabited today and is an unorganized and unincorporated territory of the United States. Americans had developed a growing relationship with China and the Chinese during the 19th century. Thousands of Chinese workers emigrated to the United States to participate in the California Gold Rush and also to construct the Transcontinental Railroad completed in 1869. The old China trade brought rare commodities from the Far East to ports as far away as Salem and Boston, Massachusetts. The trade relationship between the United States and China became so significant that the United States signed the Treaty of Shanghai with the Imperial Chinese government in 1848. The treaty granted the United States broad trading rights in China, and like several other Western powers, American influence continued to grow, not just on the coast, but also into the interior of China. Many feared that China was on the verge of being carved up into colonies, as had happened in the same century to the continent of Africa during the so-called Scramble for Africa. The Dutch, Russians, Japanese, British, French, Germans, and Americans all wanted a piece of the Far Eastern nation. While the reigning Qing dynasty was too weak to head off the division of Chinese territory, a Western nation that blocked the advances of others may be effective in preventing the territorial demise of Imperial China. It was the Americans under the open door policy that prevented a similar dismemberment of China as had happened throughout Africa. The open door policy, as it came to be known, stood in stark contrast to the colonial or closed door approach Western powers were implementing in Africa. The United States called on all the major powers to not take advantage of a weakened China and carve it up like a melon, and rather preserve its territorial integrity. The open door policy was proposed by American Secretary of State John Hay, who issued what he called his open door notes in 1899 to all the involved imperial nations. China was not to be divided into colonies, but was free to trade with all states on an equal basis. The major imperial powers were empowered to establish proprietary trading zones, or spheres of influence as they were called. These would be zones on the Chinese coast and extending into the interior in which a singular power could operate exclusively. Thus, zones rather than colonies would characterize foreign involvement in China for the decades to come. The major powers also promised not to interfere with other treaty ports or interests. Chinese authorities were permitted to collect tariffs on an equal basis, but Chinese citizens received no special favors in the paying of harbor dues or railroad rates. Although the open door notes did not really include an enforcement mechanism, and the policy could not prevent popular rebellions, a revolution, a civil war, and a foreign invasion in the decades to come, at least the open door policy protected the territorial integrity of China, leaving at least the potential for the emergence of a strong modern state. The irony of the policy was that even as Americans came to fear the growing power and wealth of a modern China in the 21st century, they had no one to blame except for themselves for preventing the breaking up of the Far East nation and enabling it to have an opportunity for immeasurable growth. As a sign of the continued instability in China, as the reigning Qing dynasty continued to fade from relevance and foreigners seemed to be constantly taking advantage of China at every turn, a large rebellion broke out at the end of the 19th century that proved rather scary for foreigners and horrifically bloody for Chinese villagers. The Society of Harmonious Fists were one of the many Chinese martial arts societies, called boxers by Westerners, that were popular and attracted an amazed following, particularly in rural China. For many rural Chinese living in debilitating poverty and famine, an elite martial arts society that promised to drive away China's problems, namely foreigners, and strengthen the power of the Qing dynasty, seemed very attractive. Recruiters for the boxers would enter remote villages, perform some martial art tricks, and then rally all the able bodied males to join the boxers and join the rebellion. Unlike the Taipings in their rebellion 40 years earlier, the boxers actually supported the emperor and the Qing dynasty, but opposed the corrupting influence of foreigners. They particularly targeted Western Christian missionaries and Chinese who had converted to Christianity. Hundreds of missionaries connected to Hudson Taylor's China Inland Mission were slaughtered in the rebellion, and even more Chinese Christians. What originated as a rural movement spread very quickly and gradually made its way to the coast, where more foreign trading zones were located. Hundreds of foreigners ran for their lives and sought refuge within the walls of the Forbidden City, even though this royal palace complex was traditionally forbidden to outsiders and non-royalty. With a large assemblage of foreigners trapped behind the walls of the Forbidden City and the boxers moving in their direction in Peking, multiple foreign powers sent a relief expedition to protect their nationals and drive back the boxers. 8 nations allied to lift the siege against their nationals behind the walls of the Forbidden City, including Americans, Austro-Hungarians, British, French, German, Italian, Japanese, and Russian. The siege was lifted. Peking was in foreign hands, and the foreign troops moved against the Boxers, eventually quelling the rebellion. The greatest significance of the Boxer Rebellion for the United States was that clearly America had entered a new role on the world stage by sending troops as far away as China to secure its interests. It was clear that the future for the United States would not be an isolated power that stuck to its own borders. Americans proved that they were interested in playing a larger role on the world stage, and their intervention during the Boxer Rebellion proved exactly that. Even as the United States was sending troops to China to rescue its citizens and crush the Boxers, it was clear that there was a growing resentment against the Chinese in America. Despite coming in large numbers during the California Gold Rush and during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese were viewed with growing suspicion by Americans and accused of monopolizing opportunities and wages against other Americans. A prominent voice in California against Chinese immigration was labor leader and Irish immigrant Dennis Kearney. Kearney was an immigrant himself, but he saw an opportunity among the disenfranchised in California to blame all problems on politicians, capitalists, the press, but particularly Chinese immigrants. In fact, he ended all of his speeches to his listeners, regardless of the topic of the speech, with the words, quote, "And whatever happens, the Chinese must go," unquote. Although his national influence was minimal, Kearney took credit for the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed by Congress and signed by President Chester Arthur in 1882. The act prohibited further Chinese working-class immigration for 10 years. There were some exceptions for teachers, students, merchants, travelers, and diplomats. But the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first act ever passed by the Congress that specifically banned one racial category from entering the United States. The act would be in place until 1943 and later overturned by additional congressional acts that opened the country to broad Chinese immigration. But for many Chinese living in the United States at the end of the 19th century, the damage had been done. Some Chinese communities were driven out from their localities and forced to relocate and move on. Violence was not isolated. The act strained U.S.-China relations until the Second World War, when the act was repealed in order to secure the Chinese as an essential ally against the Japanese in the Far East. Japanese émigrés faced a similar form of harassment and discrimination at the turn of the century. Japanese immigrants did not come to the United States in the same numbers as the Chinese did during the gold rush and railroad construction, Shogunate Japan prevented many of its citizens from leaving the island nation. Yet with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, policies regarding immigration were loosened and more Japanese came to the United States. What distinguished Japanese immigration from Chinese immigration was the propensity of the Japanese to arrive in family groups, intending to stay long-term in the United States, as opposed to working-age Chinese men who worked for a time in America and then intended to return to China. Japanese immigrants adopted American dress, learned English, and sought to be fully integrated into American life and culture. Yet they were viewed with suspicion, often lumped together with the Chinese, and many, particularly in California, called for the Chinese Exclusion Act to be expanded to include Japanese immigrants. California even established segregated schools in which the Japanese were to be educated. President Theodore Roosevelt quelled the tensions emerging on the West Coast by agreeing to a gentleman's agreement with the Japanese imperial government. This was not a treaty needing Senate ratification, but an unofficial agreement between the American government and the Japanese government. The Japanese government agreed to issue no further passports for its citizens to emigrate to the United States, and the American government agreed to avoid more formal immigration restrictions against the Japanese, permit existing Japanese to remain in the United States, and allow additional family members to come to the United States. The gentleman's agreement settled the issue for the moment, but a growing chorus of voices in the United States would warn of a yellow peril, an expansive Japan on the march in the Far East, and Japan would look with increased resentment against the United States for its refusal to recognize it as an emerging equal world power. The tension would explode into war during the Second World War. The presidencies near the beginning of the 20th century are usually considered the most formative for national expansion and imperialism. Several ventures in imperialism occurred during the presidency of William McKinley, but McKinley was never considered a strong and assertive leader. He often seemed to be led by events rather than orchestrating them himself. The American presidency and its intentions for imperialism became much more assertive, however, during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt believed in a more active role for the United States in the world, in which it would not act as a bully or aggressor against smaller states, but it would be firm and defend its national interests. The hope was to negotiate disputes peacefully, but to exert strength and force if challenged, and to be prepared to do so. Roosevelt summarized his approach to foreign policy by citing an African proverb which stated, "Walk softly and carry a big stick." The United States would not look for a fight, but it also would not back down in the face of one. In this cartoon, Roosevelt is depicted as a giant policeman carrying a nightstick labeled "The New Diplomacy." The cartoon suggests the smaller peoples of Europe and colonized nations would submit to his arbitration and strength to resolve disputes. A prime example of Roosevelt's new nationalistic big stick diplomacy was on display in the means he took to achieve the construction of the Panama Canal. The dream of locating a water route that would cut across the Americas and connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans dated back as far as the Age of Discovery, when the Spanish sought such a passage. Although a multitude of nations offered their own canal plans, none of them came to fruition before the 19th century. The California gold rush generated a new interest in constructing a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. However, as steamships from the east coast of the United States would journey down to the isthmus and then offered overland portage across Panama before crews and cargo were reloaded onto another steam and continued up the west coast of North America up to the port of San Francisco. The majority of gold extracted from California and sent east was transported, in fact, overland across the Isthmus of Panama. In 1850, the United States constructed the Panama Railroad, which greatly facilitated the ease and speed across the isthmus, but a waterway was still the dream of many. After proving their canal construction skills by digging the Suez Canal, the French government signed an agreement in 1878 with the Colombian government, which owned the Panamanian Isthmus, before its independence, and the French set to work to building the canal. Commencing the project would be the French engineer and diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps, who had successfully seen to the digging of the Suez Canal. The French were quickly overwhelmed by the challenge of the project, however. The jungles of Panama were not at the same flat sea level as they were at the Suez site. The tropical heat, flooding, rains, humidity, snakes, bats, rodents, spiders, and insects proved a formidable match for the French seeking to connect the oceans. The project became a war of attrition with nature, with up to 200 Frenchmen dying each month working in the jungles of Panama by 1884. The absence of a broader, established route and the need to construct locks further complicated the project. Mosquitoes carrying yellow fever and malaria were wiping out the French workers, as it was not yet known that the insects were the ones carrying the pathogens. The French project finally went bankrupt in 1889 with investors losing their money. The company expending $287 million and 22,000 Frenchmen perishing in the jungles of Panama due to disease or construction accidents. As the French began to draw down their project in Panama, they sought a buyer for their construction company to cut their losses and leave Panama. The Frenchman, Philippe Bonneau-Varilla, was in charge of the French Canal Company, and reacting to American proposals of digging their own canal through neighboring Nicaragua, agreed to sell the French holdings in Panama to the United States for $40 million. The United States immediately agreed to the deal. The Americans immediately approached Gran Colombia, the owner of the Panamanian Isthmus, with a treaty that would purchase U.S. control over the canal zone at $10 million, to be followed by an annual lease payment by the U.S. to Colombia of $250,000. The lease of the canal zone from Colombia would be in perpetuity. Although the United States ratified the treaty, the Colombian Senate did not. The Colombians believed by holding out they could secure a larger payment from the Americans with greater concessions. President Roosevelt was furious and believed the Colombian government was obstructing the progress of civilization and stood in the way of the interests of the United States and even in the way of global progress. Roosevelt and his Secretary of State looked for an alternate means to secure U.S. control over the proposed canal zone. They found that means by deciding to support a nascent rebellion by the Panamanians on the isthmus against the Colombian government. For years previously, the local Panamanians had attempted many revolts against their colonial masters, the Colombians, but their separatist intentions had always been crushed by the Colombian armed forces. The United States had never desired to intervene on behalf of the Panamanians before. But seeing an opportunity now, Philippe Bonneau-Varilla agitated the Panamanians to revolt again and gave the United States a heads up that the revolt was coming. Roosevelt dispatched U.S. naval ships, including the USS Nashville, to remain off the coast of Panama to support the Panamanians in their revolt and to block any suppression of the revolution by the Colombian government. This time, with U.S. protection, the revolt succeeded, and Panama declared itself an independent nation from Colombia. Immediately, the United States recognized the new Republic of Panama and quickly signed the same agreement previously offered to the Colombians. Panama accepted, and Colombia was left without its northern province and any deal for a canal zone. The United States immediately set to work with the Army Corps of Engineers to construct the canal, and it was finally completed in 1914. Roosevelt was thrilled with the U.S. acquisition of the canal zone and the prospect of the Americans finally seeing to the completion of the project. He famously remarked, "I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me." Roosevelt personally journeyed to the canal zone during its construction during his presidency, becoming the first president to leave the continental United States during his administration. In a white suit, he greeted the workers, climbed up on the steam shovels, asked a multitude of questions, and congratulated the men on their splendid progress. The man Roosevelt appointed to see to the construction and opening of the canal was George Washington Goethals. Goethals was a civil engineer and army officer. He prized efficiency and avoided the bureaucratic hang-ups that had doomed the canal project in the past. Goethals' administration was so successful that he actually managed to have the canal open 2 years ahead of schedule. Goethals was particularly aided by two army officers who effectively resolved the disease and sanitation challenges of the canal project. Walter Reed was an army physician who sought to understand the relationships within disease transmission. Building on the work of a Cuban physician, Reed concluded it was mosquitoes that provided the disease vector for infections of yellow fever and malaria, and not from direct contact with the water or clothing of those infected. Reed assisted in the canal project by calling for the elimination of the local mosquito population, which would come close to eradicating the diseases wiping out the canal work forces. William Crawford Gorges was an army physician who came to trust new theories proving that it was mosquitoes that were responsible for the transmission of jungle diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. As the chief sanitary officer of the canal project, Gorges demanded the draining of standing bodies of water, such as ponds and swamps. He advocated fumigating living areas and broad use of mosquito netting. Gutters were to be cleaned and drained, and public water systems improved to provide clean water. Mosquito breeding plummeted, as did cases of malaria and yellow fever. He is credited with saving thousands of lives for those who worked on the canal project. The work of these two health officials enabled the work of the canal project to move forward with a far lower mortality rate. The Panama Canal was the most difficult canal to ever be constructed. The 51-mile-long canal had to be dug through dense jungle growth and dense rocky soil that constantly threatened to cave in and collapse on the workers. In order for ships to traverse Lake Gatun in the center of the isthmus, locks were required to be constructed on both shores of Panama, lifting and then lowering a vessel 85 feet above sea level. American Army Corps of Engineers purchased and used portions of the French equipment and then brought additional steam-powered shuttles to the project as well. The swath of the canal zone needed to be cut wider to avoid cave-ins and collapses by staircasing the surrounding soil walls. The Panama Railway, which ran parallel to the canal's proposed route, was put to use, carrying away soil and rock, and additional lines were laid to accelerate the project as well. Some sections required solid rock to be blasted loose and then removed. Everywhere the excavated soil seemed wet or outright mud. Tropical rains loosened sidewalls and drenched the bottoms of work sites with several feet of water. The water then needed to be pumped out before work could continue. The locks, essentially water elevators that would float a vessel up or down between individual chambers, took enormous ingenuity and resources to be moved onto the site. The original locks were 110 feet wide. Although reaching Gatun Lake presented the enormous challenge of building the locks, the lake also provided the 52 million gallons of water needed just to raise and lower the locks to traverse just one ship the length of the canal. Service rails were constructed on the sides of the locks to facilitate the movement of powerful automated locomotives that would help guide ships through the canal. Multiple vehicles known as mules run on the rails and do not pull the ships through the canal, but rather keep the ships centered as they move through the locks. The canal was at last completed in 1914, 2 years ahead of schedule, at the cost of $500 million, equivalent to $14.6 billion today. The first ship to make use of the canal and transit its 51 miles at the formal opening was the SS Ancon, which passed through on August 15, 1914. In its first year of operation, 1,000 ships traversed the canal. In the years to come, the Panama Canal would prove an invaluable resource to the United States Navy, which made use of the canal during the World Wars and Cold War of the 20th century. Even World War II aircraft carriers could pass through the canal. Here, the USS Missouri traverses the Panama Canal after being docked in Tokyo Harbor to receive the Japanese surrender on her decks at the conclusion of World War II. The Panama Canal and its surrounding zone would remain under U.S. control until the Torrijos-Carter Treaties of 1977. Exclusive control and ownership of the canal by the government of Panama commenced in 1999. Over the years, the Panama Canal has been expanded, upgraded, and portions have even been rebuilt. A third, wider lane of locks was constructed between 2007 and 2016, allowing larger container ships to traverse the canal. Over 15,000 vessels travel through the canal each year, taking an average of 11 and a half hours to do so. Explorers during the Age of Discovery had always sought an east-west passage across the Americas rather than sailing all the way across South America. The Panama Canal at last provided that passageway. It remains one of the most important waterways in the world today. The instability and revolution that had rocked Panama before the construction of the canal also infected other Latin American nations during Roosevelt's presidency. After a recent civil war in Venezuela, several European states had suffered damages and Venezuela had run up significant debts to European creditors. Seeking payment, British and German and Italian warships had imposed a blockade of Venezuela, refusing to leave until their debts were paid. Roosevelt was unnerved by the presence of European fleets acting in the Western Hemisphere and viewed any military action by the Europeans as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. An international body eventually arbitrated the dispute and the blockade ended, but Roosevelt decided to assert American authority in the region before it could flare up again. The means the U.S. took under President Roosevelt to secure stability in the hemisphere became known as the Roosevelt Corollary. The United States' relationship with Latin America had been guided by the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, first declared in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine had declared the Americas closed to colonization and that European nations were to stay away from meddling in the Americas, as the United States promised not to meddle in European affairs. When instability unsettled Latin America, or when European powers threatened to right the wrongs they felt they had endured, Roosevelt felt that in the name of his big stick diplomacy, the United States had to step in. The Roosevelt Corollary was considered a direct inference stemming from the Monroe Doctrine, in which to apply that doctrine, the United States would be able to intervene in Latin American affairs on a broader scale. If states within its hemisphere did not effectively manage its finances and ran up large debts to European creditors that threatened conflict, then the United States would step in and resolve the financial disputes. The Roosevelt Corollary assigned a financial policing power to the United States over Latin America, which the U.S. had not previously claimed, and was designed to further abate European involvement in the hemisphere. The first use of the Roosevelt Corollary occurred the very next year in 1905, when the Dominican Republic failed to pay its European creditors, and the U.S. stepped in and took control of the Dominican Republic's custom houses and oversaw its payments to the Europeans. The Roosevelt Corollary, as a guiding principle for U.S. Latin American relations, would last only until the Clark Memorandum of 1928 and the Declaration of the Good Neighbor Policy of 1933, after which the United States and Latin America embarked on a new era of independence, sovereignty, and cooperation. The Roosevelt Corollary was another demonstration of Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy and conformed well to his perceptions of America's role in the world. Roosevelt genuinely believed there were two elements to his big stick diplomacy, those of force and diplomacy. Roosevelt demonstrated his ability to walk softly in international relations when he offered the resources of the United States to negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Although the war had delivered crushing defeats to the Russians in Manchuria and in the Sea of Japan at the Battle of Tsushima, the war was also wearing down Japan, whose supply lines were overextended and the war proved very unpopular at home as it debilitated the Japanese economy. Roosevelt approached both sides with a good faith offer to play mediator and bring the war to a close. After both sides experienced further losses, both the Russians and Japanese agreed. The two sides met at the Portsmouth Naval Yard located in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in August of 1905. Roosevelt greeted the representatives from both nations, but let others commence the negotiations. The subsequent Treaty of Portsmouth was successfully negotiated rather quickly, with both sides making concessions. An immediate ceasefire was declared between the two nations. Japan's sovereignty over the Korean peninsula was recognized by Russia. The Russians agreed to evacuate its troops from Manchuria, grant Port Arthur to the Japanese along with the South Manchurian Railway, local mines, and the southern portion of Sakhalin Island. Russia was satisfied not being forced to pay any reparations to Japan, who had clearly bested them in the war. Both the Japanese and Russian governments ratified the treaty in the coming months, and President Roosevelt was celebrated as a skillful orchestrator of peace. Theodore Roosevelt became the first American president to be a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, which he was awarded in 1906. Additional evidence of the expanded role of the United States took on the world stage during the administration of Theodore Roosevelt was the voyage of the Great White Fleet between 1907 and 1909, ordered by the president himself. The stated purpose of the fleet's voyage was a sign of American goodwill around the globe. Most around the world, though, realized that the voyage of the fleet was a show of America's new naval strength and broadcasting to the world its new role in world affairs. 16 U.S. battleships and various escorts conducted the circumnavigation of the globe. The fleet earned its nickname from the white hulls the ships featured, which was the Navy's peacetime color scheme. The hulls were decorated with gilded scrollwork, and red, white, and blue banners were unfurled across their bows. The superstructures of the ships were painted buff, a brownish yellow that was a traditional military color. The Great White Fleet's journey was manned by 14,000 sailors, covered 43,000 nautical miles, and made 20 ports of call on 6 continents. While the sight of the fleet was impressive and much of it almost entirely new, the construction of the even newer and bigger Dreadnought class of battleships made the Great White Fleet already out of date when it was sailing. The Navy did learn a great deal more about ship construction because of the voyage, and immediate improvements were ordered for subsequent battleship construction in the United States. These improvements were critical as the U.S. Navy approached involvement in both World War I and World War II. Although he lacked the energy and charisma of Roosevelt, William Howard Taft held his own perhaps quieter but still grand plan for expanding America's role in the world, particularly in Central America. Taft's plan was more economic than military. Nicknamed dollar diplomacy, Taft sought to increase America's strength in the Western Hemisphere through economic investment and credit in the smaller states of the Americas. In his message to Congress in 1912, Taft described his plan as, quote, substituting dollars for bullets, unquote. Taft's dollar diplomacy only expanded the economic dominance the United States enjoyed in the hemisphere and sought to achieve political stability in the Americas through financial stability. As these charts indicate, Latin America was the target of nearly half of the U.S. investment, with the majority of these ventures directed towards mining, agriculture, oil, and railroads. Dollar diplomacy brought an enhanced role for the United States in the region, with an abundance of positive outcomes, but also with some destabilizing effects. The most prominent example of Taft's dollar diplomacy was the immense role that the United Fruit Company played in Latin American countries. Seeking to capitalize on the tropical lands and climates of South America for growing fruit, the United Fruit Company often negotiated very favorable deals with South American states that primarily benefited the company. The United Fruit Company purchased large tracts of land in the Southern Hemisphere at a low price, constructed large plantations to grow citrus, papaya, mangoes, pineapples, berries, grapes, and most of all, bananas. The vast majority of the fruit, as well as the profits, were sent back to the company's headquarters located in the United States. Poor agricultural workers in these South American states often had no other opportunity than to agree to work for the United Fruit Company for a low wage, long hours, and in very hot and humid conditions. By the 1930s, the United Fruit Company owned an incredible 3.5 million acres of land in Central America and the Caribbean, and was the single largest landowner in Guatemala itself. Such economic power gave the company vast political influence in South American states. The dominance of the United Fruit Company led to many of the smaller South American states to become nicknamed banana republics. A growing resentment developed between the poor laborers working for the United Fruit Company and the company leaders and politicians who seemed to be enriched at the expense of others' labors. In time, these resentments would burst into rebellions, riots against the power of the company, or even revolutions. Seeking to quell the disturbances south of the border, a new president offered another new vision for American foreign policy upon his inauguration. During his campaign for president in 1912, Woodrow Wilson offered what he believed to be a better alternative to the imperialism of Europeans, the big stick diplomacy of Roosevelt, and the economic focus of Taft's dollar diplomacy. Wilson referred to his foreign policy approach as moral diplomacy, the idea that the United States would only support nations that held similar values as the United States. Wilson believed collaboration with despots, or using underhanded means to achieve foreign policy goals, was a betrayal of the very identity of the United States. He believed the United States was unique and exceptional, and that the nation's mission was to spread democracy, liberty, individualism, and egalitarianism. Wilson's ideal for foreign relations was for two honorable states to come together to work for a common purpose. Denmark had owned the islands of the West Indies for nearly 200 years, but tropical storms and the collapse of the sugar plantations made the islands no longer economically viable for Denmark. Multiple negotiations had occurred before between the United States and Denmark regarding the islands being purchased by the Americans, but the negotiations always broke down. Yet as war in the Atlantic heated up during World War I, the Wilson administration grew worried that Imperial Germany would seize the islands and construct submarine bases for its fleet of U-boats immediately off of U.S. shores. In 1916, Denmark agreed to a sale price of $25 million to be paid in U.S. gold coin. The U.S. took possession of the islands in 1917. Neighboring the British Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands consist of the three main islands of St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. Another 50 islands and cays make up the remainder of the territory of the United States. The U.S. Virgin Islands became a popular tourist destination for Americans after the U.S. embargo and travel ban against Cuba commenced during the Cold War. Wilson's moral diplomacy was not always readily accepted by the other states in Latin America against whom Wilson mostly directed his policy. Frustration with bad government, corrupt dictators, or endless insurgencies destabilizing Latin American republics provoked U.S. involvement in a multitude of countries in the Southern Hemisphere to protect American interests. These disturbances in South American states often began with the United Fruit Company purchasing large tracts of land, generating large profits through its fruit industry, but then alienating the local population, which felt it deserved a larger share of the profits. Uprisings, rebellions, coups, civil wars, and attacks against Americans often were not resolved until units of the American Marine Corps were landed and then restored order. The conflicts in U.S. police actions were nicknamed Banana Wars because of the economies and regions in which they occurred. From the conclusion of the Spanish-American War until the inauguration of the Good Neighbor policy in 1933, such banana wars occurred in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Mexico, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Panama. Involvement in South American states was further evidence that the United States had entered a new era beyond its own shores and towards international involvement. The Marines often put down rebel groups or popular disturbances to restore order or remained with boots on the ground until a nation rewrote its constitution and held free elections. The commencement of the Good Neighbor policy in 1934 largely ended these police actions, particularly as the United States became more focused on the conflicts in Europe and other upheavals around the world. President Wilson endeavored to apply his conceptions of moral diplomacy south of the U.S. border in U.S.-Mexican relations. Mexico was racked by a series of revolutions and civil wars between 1910 and 1920. A variety of factions contended for power and control of the government, forming allies to gain power and then betraying alliances when it was subsequently convenient. One of the more charismatic leaders during this period of Mexican upheaval was Francisco Pancho Villa. Villa had experience both in the government and the army. He was not averse to switching sides as various Mexican factions fought for control, and at various points, he found himself on both the winning or the losing side repeatedly. When yet another revolutionary seized power as president named Venustiano Carranza, Villa found himself once again out of favor with the prevailing regime. The United States provided aid to support Carranza's faction, and thus the supported Carranza was able to overwhelm Villa's small rebel band, depriving him of resources and particularly money to pay his private soldiers. Angry at the United States for supporting Carranza's faction and lacking supplies and supporters, Villa ambitiously embarked on a course to goad the United States into the civil conflict in Mexico, hoping that his fortunes would turn. He decided to launch an attack against the United States. Rather ambitiously, Villa ordered his subordinates to cross the U.S.-Mexican border and attack the 13th Cavalry Regiment posted at Columbus, New Mexico. 500 of Villa's men crossed the border and quickly ambushed and overwhelmed the American troops stationed at Columbus. Villa's men burned a portion of the town and killed nearly 20 people, soldiers and residents, before they retreated across the border. The nation and President Wilson was outraged that a Mexican revolutionary could so brazenly cross into U.S. territory and murder U.S. troops and civilians. The president ordered 10,000 U.S. troops to move south of the border to pursue Villa and bring him to justice. The punitive expedition, or Pancho Villa expedition, was commanded by General John J. Pershing and assisted by other collaborating Mexican officials and generals. A young U.S. cavalry officer named George S. Patton gained some of his earliest campaigning experience during the expedition. The expedition lasted from March 1916 to February 1917. Despite following up on tips, fording streams, climbing mountains, and traversing deserts in the Mexican summer, Villa always stayed ahead of the U.S. expedition and managed to elude capture. Some of Villa's men were taken by the U.S. troops, but never Villa himself. To compound the difficulty of the operation, President Carranza dispatched Mexican troops to block further penetration of the Americans into Mexico, not wanting his government to be embarrassed or to appear needing help from the Americans. The American expedition broke off the search, but remained for a time in Mexico, encouraging authorities to continue their pursuit and capture of Villa. Villa would eventually broker a deal with the Mexican government to lay down his arms and be granted an estate, but his retirement ended prematurely when he was assassinated in 1923. The United States eventually lost interest in the Mexican expedition and began focusing its concerns on the war in Europe. General Pershing would depart from the Mexican expedition and, along with the young George Patton, go to the battlefields of Europe once the United States entered the First World War in April of 1917. Not all Americans were pleased with the new international focus of the United States. Many objected strenuously to the idea that the United States, which had prized life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in its founding document, should become an imperial power and turn others into colonial subjects. The Anti-Imperialist League was formed in 1898 to protest this New Manifest Destiny, and called the nation back to George Washington's farewell address, in which the first president definitely seemed to caution against overseas internationalism and adventurism. The Anti-Imperialism League attracted some notable famous names to its cause, including former President Grover Cleveland, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, AFL President Samuel Gompers, and the popular writer Mark Twain. The Anti-Imperialist League never won the national argument about imperialism at the turn of the century, however. More forcible personalities, such as Theodore Roosevelt, won the nation's ear. So the Anti-Imperialism League was often small, largely ineffectual, and finally disbanded in 1920. The age of American imperialism coincided with a strong swell in American nationalism and fervent assertion of America's role in the modern world. That nationalism was particularly expressed in the marches and popular tunes composed by John Philip Sousa. Sousa was the longtime conductor of the Marine Corps Band, and he composed a multitude of tunes and marches for the Corps that also became popular with the general public. His most notable marches included the Stars and Stripes Forever, Semper Fidelis, and the Washington Post. Sousa's compositions would become mainstays at 4th of July parades and fireworks displays for decades to come. Peppy tributes to the United States and to its expansive endeavors beyond its continent, across the oceans, to many foreign lands, during the age of American imperialism.